Okay, cool. Awesome. And if it sounds like I'm going to be talking fast, it's going to be because I am, because usually this talk is 30 minutes long. So, and I've had a lot of Diet Coke already. It's only 11 a.m. here in Chicago where I am. Before we jump in, though, because I already said I didn't have enough time, but we're still going to do that. I wanted to point out. So I work at Plumi. That's the extent of how much I'm going to talk about Plumi. We can talk about Plumi some other time. One of the things, though, is I am one of the global organizers of the DevOps Days event around the world. And I did want to point out that there is a virtual DevOps Days Ukraine that is taking place in a few weeks as a fundraiser to resources in Ukraine. And if you go to devopsdays.org/Ukraine, you can find out all about it. But for now, let's go into our talk. So next slide, please. We'll see how this goes. So really quick, I do like to provide a content warning. We'll be talking about trauma and post-traumatic stress. We'll not be talking about any specific instances of trauma, but be aware that we will be talking about post-traumatic stress and treatments related to that, so you are aware. Next slide, please. Again, along those lines, just for context, I am a trauma survivor. Click. But I am not a mental. Oh my goodness. So, okay. Well, with that head really quick, it said I am not a mental health professional. That was the thing. Maybe my build slides don't work as well in this change. Okay. This is going to be fun. Resilience. Let's go. Okay. Next slide. This is introduction. Yeah, I like Diet Coke. Next. We don't need to talk about me so much. I work at Plumi. Awesome. Plumi Puss likes Diet Coke. And apparently, according to Ryan Kitchens of Netflix, I have the best hair. Next slide. Let's get into the content. Okay, cool. So check it out. This is a zebra. So if we start to think about a zebra, okay, we're on there. There's our zebra. That's all we want is just a zebra. Looks good. Cool. This is a zebra that's at rest, just chilling out. There's no threat of predators, just thinking maybe eating some grass, thinking about making some more zebras. This zebra is operating within the rest and digest function of the parasympathetic nervous system. Now we introduce a lion, right? So a lion starts chasing the zebra. And we get some drastic physiological changes occur with the activation of what's called the fight or flight response of the sympathetic nervous system. The heart rate increases, the breathing increases. There's large amounts of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline are released into the bloodstream. The zebra's pupils dilate, blood pressure increases, and basically anything non-essential like digestion just stop, because the zebra's nervous system is preparing it to literally run for its life. Now, if the zebra gets caught, its nervous system is overwhelmed and it has no further solutions and it freezes. This is, maybe we might consider this kind of an injection of trauma in a person. So if the zebra survives the encounter, so the zebra, it literally, what does it do? It shakes. It's shaking it off. It returns to a resting state. Now, before we go to the next slide, I want you to be prepared. This next slide is possibly the absolute most important thing you're going to learn at this entire event all day. So be ready for your notes or for your screenshots. Go ahead and move to the next slide, please. We are not zebras, okay? So the autonomic nervous system is common to all mammals, zebras and humans, but we as humans have this thing called a prefrontal cortex, and zebras do not. The prefrontal cortex is usually an advantage. This is where executive function happens. Our understanding of the difference between good and bad, pattern recognition, understanding consequences. However, the disadvantage is the prefrontal cortex is where we mentally replay these traumatic scenarios, which activates our sympathetic nervous system exactly like the real threat would do. So our brains are beautifully brilliant, and they're also incredibly dumb, right? They can't tell the difference between perceived trauma and real trauma as it's happening. So next slide, please. So this example I was giving, the zebra example, was first popularized by Dr. Peter Levine, who points out that animals in the wild are not traumatized by these routine threats. Humans, we get overwhelmed and often subject to hyperarousal, shutdown, and dysregulation. And move to the next slide. This is this thing in a healthy nervous system. Now, we're not even keeled all the time. We can get activated by things, and that activates that sympathetic nervous system. We kind of move up a little bit. We settle, we bring down. It kind of looks like a sine wave. We're kind of surfing. It looks all good. This is kind of where this comes in. Now, on the other hand, if we go to the next slide, and we will see This is when we have undischarged traumatic stress. So a traumatic event happens, and instead of us being able to come back down, it either looks like, for those of you who work in ops, this might look like a crazy availability graph, and this might be triggering you for a whole different reason. But some of my Nagios charts look like this. Well, you can either be spiking up and down, or we sometimes get stuck on or stuck off. So hyper arousal, which is being stuck on, is similar to the fight or flight stuff, but happening all the time. And when we're stuck off, we're constantly in freeze. So move on to the next slide. Here's the thing about trauma is it's not simple. There's a lot of nuance to it. Move to the next slide. And I think this is going to be a build slide. Okay, so in the first one, this happens because our nervous system has been overwhelmed. Our solution doesn't work. Next, click. And it's our nervous system activation is the same for a real or an imagined threat. And finally, click. What I perceive as overwhelming or my capacity for a solution might be different than yours. So next slide. You're like, okay, this is great, but how does this apply to our companies, to our organizations? And what I had seen was there's things look very similar. So if we go back on the next slide and we say, we look back at this dysregulated, undischarged traumatic stress. So that traumatic event could be an incident. It could be an outage. Something happens. And instead of just sort of going through it and expressing the resilience of the socio-technical system that we have, sometimes we can get stuck on and we can get stuck off. Next slide, please. If we think about an organization that is hyper aroused, right? This is what stuck on is. So some of the symptoms you might see in an org like this is display events of constant vigilance, right? It sounds like they're fighting Voldemort. They're hyper aware of threats, which takes away energy from innovation. And this is oftentimes we can see this symptomatically reflected in how our leadership approaches outages and issues. We get a lot of wartime metaphors. We have these, war rooms, and we have dedicated production support teams instead of dealing with that within feature teams. Next slide. An organization could also become hypo-aroused, which is stuck in freeze. And this is when we run into we are very, very cautious about making any kind of innovation for fear of a change, right? Because what introduces incidents changes. So let's not make any. Let's be super duper careful and think of every single thing that could possibly go wrong before we even think about doing anything. These are the organizations that want to measure 15 times before considering opening a change request to cut. This doesn't work either. And go to the next slide. So we'll see this idea of similar signals might look similar, but they're not the same. We want pattern recognition. Remember, our prefrontal cortex wants to say, I've seen something that looks like this, but it's not necessarily the same because we deal with complex systems. Next slide. We'll go past this a little bit quickly. Usually when I'm giving this talk in person, I say, how many of you got on a plane to get here? But just remember, in December 22nd of 2001, this fellow named Richard Reed tried to ignite explosives hidden in his shoes on a flight from Paris to Miami. As a result, in the United States, the TSA began randomly searching people's shoes. In 2006, the TSA mandated that everyone had to take their shoes off going through security. And, we continue to see this worldwide. So this has been going on now, 21 years ago because we look for pattern recognition, which is people who wear shoes try to do things to airplanes. Go to this next slide, please. This one's kind of interesting. So Jennifer Brea says there's a saying in medicine that when you hear hoofbeats, the first thing that should come to mind is a horse, not a zebra. You may have heard this before, but as Jennifer says, this phrase has killed many zebras, right? And this is about avoiding looking for that first root cause, that first thing we see. Also, look, we've got more zebras in the talk. Amazing. So next slide. What we want to do, and we're not going to dig into this too much because I'm running low, is you need to think about everyone, just like every individual has a different window of tolerance, which is what we saw in the design. Different organizations and companies and teams do. So you need to look back, and I want you to take a little time and think about what does your organization look like? What is your window of tolerance? Next slide. So there's a similar thought on this, which is just like what Dr. Levine said. Oh, yeah, you spoiled it. That was me. I wasn't supposed to say it was me saying this. But anyway, the idea is if we have an organization that is resilient, routine threats to our mission or business are they don't traumatize us, right? We just continue to move along. But if our organizations are not resilient, we become overwhelmed and we have shutdown and a lack of regulated effort. Now, how do we regulate? Next slide really quick. How do we take our humans and our organizations and go from that deregulated state and become regulated? The good news is we've got some things we can do. Move on to the next slide. So there's this idea. I talked about Peter Levine earlier. He created this form of alternative therapy for post-traumatic stress called somatic experiencing. And it focuses on the client's perceived body sensations, and it was created by Dr. Levine. And this is where we're leading with the body, hence soma, somatic. Okay, so go to the next slide. So if we talk about how do we do somatic experiencing for an organization, and this is creating a similar focus on the response to train ourselves to have the reactions we want to have when something traumatic happens to our organization. Next slide. I don't know how well this build is going to work because there's a build, but this is a little controversial. Come along with me. So in somatic experiencing, it's body first. We don't start with the mind. If we start with the mind, that's like looking for root cause during an incident. We're focused on the symptoms. This makes us look for the wrong pattern. See, call back to the TSA slide. So this is another one of the reasons why I don't like using the term root cause, because that implies there's, once we find it, we're good. Go ahead and click next. Instead of root cause, I much prefer to talk about the idea of contributing factors. There is one root cause. You know what the root cause is? The Big Bang. That doesn't help us. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. One of the things that we can do as organizational somatic experiencing is when we think about the ideas of game days, right? Because what we want to do is create an association of outages and issues with a safe place, a place of confidence. So a lot of times we'll do game days, or you might call it a failure Friday, but they need to be done properly. When we do these, when we do simulated incidents, you need to keep them low stress and safe. The point isn't to practice under pressure. Trust me, your folks who do response in your organization, they have plenty of experience being under pressure and under stress. We don't need to do that. So we want to go through the motions, through the exercise of responding to an incident, and we associate it with a safe environment. I always give the example, when I used to work for a company called PagerDuty, we would do our failure Fridays, which were a failure injection. We did them during the middle of the day, Pacific time in the US, on Fridays. And part of that was because there's really no good time for PagerDuty ever to be down. And actually the best time for it to be down is when most of the engineers are awake. But that way we just did this and practiced it as a normal thing. So when it happened at 2 a.m, it just reminded us of being in the office. Go ahead to the next slide. This is just sort of saying when we do our game days, we need to have guidance and structure to it, like in meditation. If you don't have guidance as you're going through meditation with trauma, you kind of go into that and then you encounter something that's a problem and you don't know what to do about it. So we need to have really good structure and plans in place for our game days. Next slide. I just talked about planned failure injection, giving the example of the failure Fridays. But the thing is, when you do planned failure injection, you follow your full incident response process, right? This does a couple things. One is it creates this organizational association, this company muscle memory that incidents are just a thing that we do. We're just good at it. We just do it all the time. Not only do we do it all the time and we have good practice, but it reminds us, like, our body kind of goes into that place, and there's really fun things we can do around that. Next slide. Just this is also why when an incident occurs, we want to run it at the initial severity, even if as we're working it, we realize it wasn't as big of a deal. We run them to the full course because, as Rain Heinrich likes to say, you want to get better at having incidents, responding to incidents. Have you tried having more of them? And the final thing to think about here, next slide, is how we process failure. So blameless, if you've heard about blameless postmortems, maybe you practice them. That's just the beginning. We have to process the failure and the outage all the way through the information that we have, and it has to have a conclusion. Otherwise, it's basically unprocessed trauma. And there's this misconception that individually processing trauma, all we have to do is just get it out. But we have to actually integrate it into our experiences as our coherent whole. And the same thing, so that includes telling our stories as we move. So go on to the next slide, which is kind of wrapping our things up. It's essential to tell our stories in our organization. That's how we process them. A write-only postmortem doesn't help anyone. And to our next slide, So being resilient means that we don't see things from the perspective of things that happen to us. It's a matter of what can we do going forward. A culture of blame creates a culture of helplessness. Final slide. This deck, as well as like supporting resources, are at speaking.mattstratton.com. I think I have this one up there. If not, I have variations of it, as well as other places I'm giving talks. I know I hope I did okay on time. Thanks for letting me be a part of this. This is really exciting, and I love to see things coming together to show excellence in the DevOps community. DevOps is a big, important part of my life.